I'm Milton Babbitt, and I'm speaking to you from the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Center in New York City. The center was established in 1959 and was the first of its kind in the United States. The studios here contain a variety of equipment used in the production of electronic music, including the RCA Mark II synthesizer. Another Columbia University facility houses a high-speed digital computer which can produce any sound, any succession of sounds, or any combination of sounds. We're going to see and hear how composers use such equipment to produce musical works which challenge the ears and the imagination. An electronic music studio usually has several tape recorders so that compositions can be recorded and stored on tape. But the tape recorder can also serve another important function. In certain electronic works, the composer begins by taping natural, instrumental, or vocal sounds and using the tape recorder to modify them. For instance, it's possible to take a single sound, say a trombone note, record it, and then use the tape recorder to alter the sound in various ways. Listen to this trombone note. Now we'll play the note backwards on tape and also slow the speed of the tape recorder. Now listen to it forward and backward simultaneously at a slow speed. Even these simple operations alter the sound quite a bit. Let's listen to the trombone note again. When an instrument plays a note, the sound doesn't just begin and end abruptly. It has a shape called its envelope. The envelope consists of the attack, the time it takes for the note to reach a given pitch and loudness. Next, a relatively steady state when the note remains at a certain level of pitch and loudness. And finally, the decay, the time it takes for the sound to die away. The envelope of a sound contributes to its distinctive quality. A xylophone note, for example, has an envelope like this, with a sharp attack, no real steady state, and an immediate decay. When a gong is struck, the sound builds up slowly to its highest point and then gradually decays. The envelope of any traditional instrument is part of its characteristic sound. To create electronic music, however, the composer must design and control the envelope of every note in his composition. He might alter the envelope of a sound by performing some of the simple operations I just described. Or he might decide to use only part of a sound, perhaps just the attack or decay. He does this by recording the sound and then cutting the tape to eliminate the unwanted portion. The tape recorder enables the composer of electronic music to work directly with the sounds in his composition rather than merely notating the sounds on paper. The piece you're listening to now is entitled Of Wood and Brass, and it was composed by Vladimir Ussachevsky, one of the pioneers of electronic music in this country. Vladimir, why is your piece entitled Of Wood and Brass?
The title of the piece refers to the brass and wood instruments, which produced almost all the original sound materials: a trombone, trumpet, xylophone, and gong. I modified these sounds to create new ones, completely unlike those of the original instruments. In the fourth section of the piece, I started with a slide, or glissando, played by a trombone. From it, I created a wide range of new sounds by using 2 tape loops. And a device called a ring modulator. The ring modulator was invented for the telephone company to make possible the transmission of many voices on the same wire. In this process, the ring modulator radically modifies sounds, and this is why it is so useful to us in electronic music. Of course, it would be difficult to duplicate exactly the operations which produce the sounds in Of Wood and Brass, but I'll give an example of the process. I have a trombone glissando on each of these tape loops. Using tape loops, I can repeat the sounds recorded on them a number of times, while I modify them in different ways. First, listen to the glissandi unmodified. The tape loops are of unequal length, so the relationship of the 2 glissandi is constantly shifting. Now I'll put the glissandi through the ring modulator. This alters the structure of the original glissandi, producing completely new sounds. Of Wood and Brass is an economical piece. It has a wide range of sounds, and yet almost all of them were created by modifying and combining a very small number of instrumental sounds.
In composing Of Wood and Brass, Vladimir started with instrumental sounds. Other composers are working in the tape studio with sounds produced directly by electronic means. How were sounds generated electronically? To understand this, we'll have to discuss the nature of sound itself. A sound originates as a vibration, an oscillation. When a string of a violin is plucked, for example, its vibrations cause the air molecules around it to vibrate. These vibrations make an impact on your eardrums, and you hear them as sound. Many sounds you hear are not conveyed directly from their original source to your ears. When you listen to a radio or phonograph record, you're really hearing sounds which have been reproduced by a different kind of vibration, the oscillation of an electrical current or voltage. Electronic oscillations are not audible in themselves, but they can be made audible by a loudspeaker, which converts them into mechanical vibrations, conveyed through the air to your ears as sound. Electronic music is based on this principle that electronic oscillations can be used to produce sound. In the electronic music studio, sounds are produced in this way by oscillators. You're familiar with one sound of an oscillator from hearing the test tone sometimes used on radio and television stations. We can represent an oscillation by this diagram, called a waveform. The waveform is a visual expression of characteristics which correspond to the sound you hear. These characteristics are the frequency, which establishes the highness or lowness, that is, the pitch of the sound, the amplitude which establishes its loudness or intensity, and the waveform shape which is related to the sound quality or timbre. I'm going to use the oscillators in the tape studio to demonstrate each of these characteristics. The frequency of a sound refers to the number of vibrations per second which produce it. The extremes of human hearing range from less than 20 cycles per second to about 20,000 cycles per second. A traditional orchestral instrument cannot produce this entire range of audible frequencies, but an oscillator can. This diagram shows one complete oscillation, called a cycle. Here, one cycle is taking place in 1/220th of a second. Therefore, the frequency is 220 cycles per second. Let's double that frequency. There are now 440 cycles per second, and the tone you hear is an octave higher. I'll double the frequency once more. There are now 880 cycles per second, and the tone is again an octave higher. The pitch of a sound is directly related to its frequency. The higher the frequency, the higher the pitch of the tone. The lower the frequency, the lower the pitch. Let's return to the tone at 440 cycles per second. I'll keep the frequency of the waveform the same, but increase its amplitude. As a result, the sound becomes louder. Now listen to the crescendo as I rapidly increase the amplitude. You've been listening to the simplest kind of tone. It's called a sine tone, and its waveform is called a sine wave. In electronic music, we usually make use of sounds that are more complex than sine tones. One way of producing a complex sound is by mixing several sine tones of different pitches. In fact, any sound you can think of can be described as a combination of a great number of sine tones. The sine tone at the top of the diagram has a frequency of 220 cycles per second. The second sine tone has a frequency of 440 cycles per second, and the third a frequency of 880 cycles per second. Mixing these three tones produces the waveform at the bottom and this sound. Let's mix four sine tones at 220, 440, 660, and 1110 cycles per second. The result is a new waveform and a new sound. Each time I change the combination of sine tones, the shape of the waveform changes, and the quality of the sound, its timbre, changes. Most tape studios have equipment which can generate certain ready-made waveforms, like sawtooth waves. The sawtooth is a complex waveform from which many other interesting waveforms can be derived. Like this one. And this one. Here I've combined a group of sounds derived from a sawtooth in rapid succession. And here's another similar combination. The envelope of a sound is also important in determining its timbre. By using these envelope controls, the composer determines the attack, steady state, and decay times of each note in a composition. I'm applying 3 different envelopes to this sawtooth wave. Listen to the changes in timbre. If a composer wants an extremely complex sound, he might obtain it by filtering white noise. White noise is like white light. It contains tones of all frequencies and intensities in the audible spectrum. White noise is a very useful sound source. By using various types of filters in a tape studio to eliminate some frequencies while allowing others to reach the ears, it's possible to obtain complex and interesting timbres. I'm going to direct white noise through several filters in the studio to show you what kinds of timbres can be obtained. The high-pass filter can be set to cut out frequencies below a certain point, allowing only the higher frequencies to reach your ears. Here it's eliminating frequencies below 4,000 cycles per second. Listen to the same sound with a percussive envelope added. The low-pass filter eliminates frequencies above a certain point so that only low frequencies are heard. I've set it to cut out frequencies above 100 cycles per second. And now I'll apply a percussive envelope to these low frequencies. Listen to groups of frequencies from both the high and low ranges combined. The bandpass filter allows frequencies within a certain range to reach your ears, but eliminates those above and below that range. The area of frequencies you hear is called the bandwidth, or frequency bandwidth. Here's a succession of sounds from the middle band of white noise. By using the tape studio equipment we've looked at, the composer can generate simple or complex sounds. He can modify the sounds by filtering, by use of the ring modulator, and in many other ways. After he records the sounds on tape, he can modify them further, using the tape recorder techniques we described earlier. In our next session, we shall see more recent and elaborate methods for producing electronic music, and we shall hear music realized in the tape studio and by synthesizers and computers. When composers write for traditional instruments, they usually mark the score for performers to indicate loudness, phrasing, and so forth. These directions must be interpreted by performers as they play. The electronic medium has fused the roles of composer and performer. In creating an electronic work, the composer is both composing and performing the work as he records it on tape. He is making decisions about loudness, tempo, phrasing, and other variables usually left, to some extent, to the performer. Some compositions make use of both electronic sounds and live performers. Mario Davidovsky has written a series of 6 works called Synchronisms. You heard his Synchronism No.1 for flute and electronic sounds at the beginning of this session. Mario, would you tell us a little about Synchronism No.1?
The electronic sounds for synchronisms were prepared in the tape studio. When the piece is performed, a flutist plays along with the tape. This is the opening of the score of Synchronisms No.1. The flute part is completely written out in traditional notation on the lower staff. The top 2 staffs refer to the taped sounds and provide cues to guide the flutist and the person operating the tape recorder. The directions start and stop show when to start and stop the tape in relation to the flute part. Starting and stopping the tape during the performance make it easier for the flutist to remain in synchronization with the tape. The flute tempo can be somewhat flexible in solo parts, but when the tape starts, the flutist must coordinate his part exactly with the taped sounds. It would be almost impossible to show the taped sounds in traditional musical notation, but in places where it is possible, I have done so. Here, as the flutist plays the note B, the tape starts, and the first taped sound is also a B. This is followed by a graceful figure in the electronic sounds similar to a flute sound. Let's listen to the piece up to that point.
Mario, why did you decide to write a piece for flute and electronic sounds?
I think the choice of a flute for the first piece was suggested to me because the facility that I would have to integrate into a coherent musical language the flute sound with electronic sound, because of the great agility of the flute practically on all its range, the great control on its dynamics, and also because the flute gave me access to certain very specific types of attacks that would facilitate the blending with electronic sounds. Listen to another excerpt from Synchronisms No.1. As you listen, notice the different kinds of interactions between the flute and electronic sounds. Sometimes they blend together, and at other points there is a clear separation between the two.
Composing in the tape studio is laborious and difficult. Every sound in a composition must be generated and modified separately, and then combined with other sounds by mixing and by splicing tape. The electronic music synthesizer was developed to overcome these practical disadvantages and to give the composer more immediate and complete control over the sounds. The first synthesizer was built by RCA in 1955, and a few years later they built a much larger one, the Mark II, which we're looking at here. It's the only one of its kind in the world. The synthesizer is made up of several panels of equipment. There are oscillators, filters, white noise generators, mixers, and in short, all of the equipment we found in the tape studio. But this equipment has been organized around central control panels that enable the composer to program all of the elements of the sounds automatically. When I want to write a piece for synthesizer, I may not write out the music in traditional notation at all, but I must give directions to the synthesizer indicating the exact frequencies, amplitudes, envelopes, and other qualities of the sounds that I want to hear. To convey this information to the synthesizer, I punch holes on these paper rolls. The pattern of holes are like coded messages. They cause the synthesizer to produce a series of electrical voltages, which are eventually converted into sound. By operating these switches, I can try out various sounds in a piece before I actually punch the paper roll. I test with the switches until I get the sounds I originally planned. Then I specify the sounds by punching the paper roll. Finally, I turn on a motor which automatically drives the paper roll through the synthesizer at any speed I choose, and at the same time the piece is recorded on magnetic tape. The speed of the paper roll determines how fast the synthesizer will play the piece. If I decide I would like to change the tempo, it is an easy matter to change the speed of the motor. Recently, a great number of smaller electronic music synthesizers have been developed, such as the Moog, the ARP, and the Buchla. All of these synthesizers are really tape studios in compact form. They offer the composer certain devices for generating and controlling sounds automatically, but these controls are not as complete and accurate as those found on the RCA synthesizer, and the composer must often splice sounds together to complete a composition, just as he does in the tape studio. During the past 12 years, I've realized a number of my compositions on the RCA synthesizer. One of these is Vision and Prayer, a setting of the poem of the same title by Dylan Thomas. It is written for soprano and synthesized sounds. Thomas's poem has a rather unusual structure. It consists of 12 shaped stanzas. The first 6 look like this one. The first line is 1 syllable long. Each successive line becomes longer by 1 syllable until a maximum length of 9 syllables is reached. The pattern is then reversed for the last half of the stanza. In the second half of the poem, each stanza begins with a line 9 syllables long, decreasing to a center line of 1 syllable and then returning to 9 syllables. The form of the poem played a large part in determining the form of the musical setting. Each stanza is set separately, and the lines of each stanza are set off from each other in the music. Listen to the first stanza, in which the soprano speaks her part.
Behind the wall, thin as a wren's bone, in the birth bloody room and the heart-print of man bows no baptism, but dark alone. Blessing on the wild child.
Unlike Davidovsky's synchronism, in which the textures of flute and electronic sounds blend together, Vision and Prayer gives prominence to the performer, and the effect is that of a soprano solo largely accompanied by electronic sounds. Another important element in synchronism is the relationship of the timbres of the flute and electronic sounds. In Vision and Prayer, I was concerned less with timbre in itself than with the rhythmic accuracy which the electronic medium makes possible. In some parts of Vision and Prayer, the tempo of the electronic sounds is faster than any performer could play. Of course, it's possible for the synthesizer to produce very accurate pitches and very complicated rhythms at any tempo. A good illustration of this is the setting of stanza 10.
Country of death is the hardest size.
Vision and Prayer is in the tradition of musical settings of poems by composers throughout the ages. It attempts, through music, to add another dimension to the imagery and sound structure of the poem. Composers of electronic music are concerned with the same questions of expressiveness and structure that musicians have always been interested in. Now we have found new ways of dealing with these questions in the electronic medium. Both the tape studio and the synthesizer give the composer the advantage of working directly with the sounds he is using in a composition. The disadvantage of the tape studio and synthesizer is the tremendous amount of specialized equipment necessary to produce all of the different musical elements which composers require. Enter the computer. The computer does not have oscillators, white noise generators, filters, or any of the audio-electronic equipment we found in the tape studio and synthesizer. The computer itself does not produce any sound. Instead, it calculates a great many numbers which represent the exact values of the electrical voltages needed to produce the sounds. Let me show how the computer does this. Suppose I want to hear a sine wave with a particular frequency and amplitude. I can calculate a series of points which accurately define the shape of the sine wave. To perform such calculations for every sound in a composition would be so time-consuming as to be practically impossible for a human being. The computer can perform these operations extremely rapidly and extremely accurately. The composer specifies the frequency, amplitude, duration, and other properties of the sounds by key-punching computer cards. From this information, the computer is able to calculate amplitudes at a great many points along the waveform. This digital tape produced by the computer contains in coded form the numbers which represent these amplitudes. This little machine, called a data translator, receives the numbers from the digital tape and changes them to electrical impulses equal to the amplitudes of the waveforms. In the final step, these impulses are transferred to ordinary magnetic recording tape. In working with the computer, the composer is not in direct contact with the sounds he is creating. He can't hear how his piece sounds until he plays the tape. However, should he wish to make any changes after hearing the piece, he can do so by repunching the necessary computer cards. Quartets and Pairs, A Piece for Computer by James Randall shows how the composer can use the computer to produce different timbres and complex and precise rhythmic effects. There are 4 distinct kinds of sounds in quartets and pairs. One is similar in sound to a plucked string. Another is like that of a clarinet. The third kind of sound consists of sine tones in a relatively low range. And finally, there are sine tones in a predominantly high range. The effect of all this is similar to 4 different instruments playing together. Listen to a short excerpt from Quartets and Pairs and try to hear the 4 parts. The 4 parts are similar to instrumental parts, but there are differences. The range of each part is much wider than that of any conventional instrument. It may move quickly from a very high note to a very low note. The timbre of each part is distinctive, especially in the use of vibrato, the slight fluctuation in pitch on certain notes. The rhythmic relationships among the parts are so complex that the piece would be very difficult for performers to play. As the composer works with the computer, or in fact with any electronic medium, he necessarily learns more about how we, as human beings, hear music. We have found that it is very difficult to predict how a particular waveform will actually sound. Long experience with traditional musical instruments has given us a great deal of information about how to write for them, but we are now dealing with new sounds for which little information exists. Much experimentation will be necessary to learn exactly what we can hear and how we hear it. Musicians are becoming interested in problems of perception posed in a unique way by our work in electronic music. And the wide range of expressiveness afforded by the electronic medium offers composers more varied musical choices and is influencing all kinds of music. New problems and new solutions are emerging as we continue to compose and listen to electronic music.